We are one. We are. We are one. We are. We are. And we are love. For we are one. We are, and we are alive. We are. You love me so much more than I could ever know. Your love is deeper than this world will ever show. And all of life's beauty shines around this moment now. The sky and the cliffs, they seem to change my life somehow. And I will never be the same. Will never be the same. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I will never be the same. Never be the same. Ever again. Well, here I am waiting, Lord, my life is just for you. Please unfold all the plans that you would have me do. And if all the world's just a breath and nothing's here to stay, then all of the love we feel will save us anyway. Will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I will never be the same, will never be the same ever again. never be the same.
Hello and welcome to another SDAQ&A. I'm your host, as always, Peter Dixon, and my very special guest today is Rochelle Siemienowicz. How are you today, Rochelle?
I'm very well, thanks, Peter. How are you?
I am terrific, and thank you so much for coming on the program today. For those watching, and we've got a nice audience today watching people from Canada, California, all around Australia as well. And we've called today's program From Missionary Kid to Polyamorous Novelist. Rochelle is looking back at an SDA upbringing. And I am so glad you've come on the program because SDA Q&A is all about interviewing people who are former Adventists, current Adventists, every kind of Adventist or former Adventist you can imagine. And we enjoy building this culture of learning about people and how the church ticks and how it affected all of us in different ways. And we were chatting off air at some point in the last couple of weeks, and you mentioned quite a happy upbringing that you had with Adventism, and we'll talk about that. I did too. I think a lot of my decisions for leaving the church were really more based on the doctrines and theology I didn't agree with, and I didn't agree with some of the politics that was going on all the time. But the people and the local churches, brilliant, had a great time. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, but we're also going to chat about two books, particularly. I think you may have written more, but we'll get into that as well. And I'm just going to share on the screen because I'm keen for people to go and buy these books, check them out. Is that showing up there, Rochelle? I think
Yep.
people can see that. I'll see if I can bring it up bigger. There we go. And this is Fallen. Tell us a little bit about this book.
Okay, so this book was published in 2015, and it was about my time as a young woman in my 20s when I basically lost my faith. So I got married very young, as you do when you don't believe in sex before marriage. And well, I was brought up very, very devout. And then I went to university and I started questioning my faith and I started seeing a bigger, wider world out there that I wanted to be a part of. And so it's kind of about the dissolving of that marriage and the dissolving of the faith alongside that. So it's sort of set over 3 weeks where it all comes to a crisis point.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. So I encourage everyone to go and check out Fallen. And then I'm going to bring up, this is the next book, which is about to come out in October, I think. And this is called Double Happiness. Tell us a little bit about this book. And this one may be controversial to some.
Yeah. I don't think polyamory is mainstream at this point, and certainly not probably among your listeners. It's a novel. It's about one woman and two men, and what if she didn't have to choose? It's written from three perspectives, and it's about the evolution of a family over the course of 7 years, from being, a fairly traditional kind of family into a different model of different model of relating and relationship.
Yeah. Okay. That's another book I'm going to buy as well. And I've got lots of reading to do in the next week. I usually try and do the reading before the interview.
Oh, I do not expect that.
It has been a bit of a crazy time. But yeah, a lot of people watching. If you look at just the engagement, whenever I have a former Adventist on, there's a high level of engagement. And I read somewhere, and look, I might be wrong, someone can fact check me on this, but I read somewhere that from about the mid 60s to the just recently, the last couple of years, over 46 million people have left the Adventist Church. There's 46 million former Adventists out there, and currently there's about 25 million, I think.
Yeah.
So
I
that
read 22 million on
so
Wikipedia this morning when I was
funny.
thinking, I need to cram.
Yeah,
I haven't been part of this for 30 years, really. So,
yeah, well, that's the other thing. And the interesting thing that you might find if you do delve in a little bit is that the current president of the church, Ted Wilson, 30, 40 years ago, his father, Neil Wilson, was the president. And the church is kind of going, it hasn't changed much in that time period. So you're cramming, it's really just names and whatnot. But the battle between I call them two churches in one, still rages on. It was there in the early 80s. And it's still going on to this day, partly because Adventist leadership doesn't truly address some of the concerns that people raise, and it suppresses. I remember in the early 80s, you might remember Des Ford. He was kind of put through a kangaroo court and defrocked. But also there was a very conservative preacher at the time called George Burnside. And I remember getting a pastor friend of mine in the, I think, early 80s from memory, gave me a fax that had been sent out either to everyone in the Sydney area or right around Australia and New Zealand. I can't remember. But anyway, they were saying, do not invite Des Ford or George Burnside to speak at our churches.
yeah,
And that, even as a young man, I was like, that really annoys me, because it's hearing both sides that people can make informed decisions. And the
yeah,
Adventist Church, I think, because they've just continued to suppress free conversation, people literally are scared to this today, even, of losing their jobs. If there's, I doubt I could get an Adventist pastor to come on. I've had one, but who would come on and say, look, I truly support women's ordination, and I think the church should go that direction, because they would lose their job over that. And you think, come on, people need to be able to share their personal views. So sadly, yeah, if you do any more cramming, I think you're going to find that it's not much difference to how it was when you left. So what you say today is as relevant right now as it was back then.
yeah. Well, that's interesting you talk about Des Ford, because that all came rushing back at me while I was looking at Wikipedia and also looking at past episodes of your podcast. The Ford crisis. This happened like in 1980. I was 8 years old. So my father, we would have people over for Sabbath lunch, and every single time it would be the Ford crisis, would be hours and hours of like conversation. I can't even tell you what my father thought about the Ford crisis, but I just know it was there in the sort of ether.
It's
And it was
huge.
like,
Yeah.
please, do we have to keep talking about this?
Well, the church is still talking about it. And I think it's because it's never been addressed. The Adventist apologists kind of whoosh it away. The leaders don't want to talk about it. They play both sides off each other. Anyway, yeah,
Mm,
I think it's important for the church to actually start having some really honest and authentic conversations, unscripted, with their members. And I think only then will things perhaps change. I'm really keen to hear a bit of your background. You mentioned you were 8 around that time, just
mm.
a little girl, and as we said earlier, you have really happy memories. Share with us some of these early memories you have of the church that you know created a positive environment for you.
Um, okay, so um, I guess my overwhelming memory is that wherever we went, my parents were missionaries in New Guinea and Fiji, and then we were at Avondale for a while, and then we went over to Perth for a few years, and then we went back to New Guinea. Wherever we went, there was a community of people who, we knew and or knew us and would welcome us in. So I think that was one of the really lovely things. And wherever you would go, you would meet people who maybe you were semi-related to, or who went to school with your mother, or that kind of thing. And I think that's a really beautiful aspect of Seventh-day Adventism. Yeah, the
Yeah.
singing, the prayer, the general sense of doing good in the world, the sense of being an important group with a message that needed to be shared. I felt very safe, I suppose, in
Mm.
that world, and I had a very loving family upbringing, and we did move around a lot, but yeah, I think it probably gave me a lot of different experiences.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't realize that. I knew you were a missionary kid, but we were New Guinea, Fiji as well.
Right,
And
right.
my parents were missionaries, teachers. So I'm sure we'd have some crossover, similar
Yeah.
places we've been to and people we
Yes.
know. But I think,
Fulton, PAU,
yeah,
those kind of
yeah.
places. Yeah.
And I agree with you. And I think too, not only did we have this sense of a special kind of we're part of something that, and we're on the edge of the end of the world and Jesus is coming back, there was enough kind of positive 60s, 70s kind of Jesus hippie gospel vibe that permeated to make it not so harsh.
Mm,
Um, I remember when I was, oh, look, I'm trying to remember. I would have been late teens maybe when I came across this book now. I don't know if you were, if you had ever read that. It's Mary Kay McLeod. You'd love her if you haven't really read anything of hers. She really did a lot to the church to bring about social change. But when she was young, she was a really talented author, and she wrote that I think when she was an equivalent to our year 12,
yeah.
as part of a project, and it's all about the end of the world. It scared the heck out of everybody. So I kind of had this lovely little Adventist Jesus is coming soon thing going on, and then in my teens I read that, and it kind of the run to the hills and your parents and families are going to split and the Sabbath is going to divide everybody and the Sunday law's coming. And did you have that kind of thing permeate into your world much?
Mm. Yeah.
Tell us a little
Yeah,
bit about that.
definitely. Um, I guess there was this sense that the world was going to end very soon, and there would be a terrible time before that happened. So the apocalypse was impending, as it basically is in the culture now, but just in a
Mm,
different way, and that we would be persecuted,
mm,
um, which was pretty terrifying for a child because um, that idea that you will have to choose your faith and possibly be killed for it or imprisoned, was taught from a very young age.
yeah,
So you heard stories of people, from repressive regimes around the world who'd had to basically die for their faith, and you were taught that that's what you would hopefully do. So yeah, that was a bit scary. And I mean, the Book of Revelation is a horror show, so yeah.
it's it's scary anyway. You've just introduced a word that I don't think I've used much on the show, but this persecution. We did feel that one day we would be persecuted.
Mm,
How do you think that ties into the theology of Adventism? Like you mentioned, Revelation's got that vibe anyway. When I look at other denominations, I was fortunate enough to play music in all sorts of different denominations and travel a lot. Um, I began noticing that a lot of the other denominations, yes, they had their hellfire and brimstone, they had their revelation, but generally as a subculture, they didn't have the fear of being persecuted one day. They were largely benign. What do you think it is about Adventist theology? And we don't have to go deep into that kind of thing, but
It's good.
Is there something? Is there something in like encased within Adventist teaching that really highlights this notion of persecution and end times, perhaps more than other religions?
Well, I don't know because I was so embedded within it, and I don't know what it's like in other religions. But I mean, there was that sense of, the interpretation of the book of Revelation and the remnant being the remnant, and having to basically defend your faith, and that was sort of part of the way things had to unfold. I mean, there was just no question. That's just how it has to be. So I'm assuming there aren't other religions, are there?
Well, I think in doing this show, and I'm coming up to 300 interviews, I'm more and more aware that there aren't any other former Baptist channels or former Episcopalian or Anglican, but there's lots of former Mormons, former JWs, and former Seventh Adventists.
Really?
And so that makes me pause to go, I think there's something more here about Adventist doctrine, teaching, and theology that marinates itself into teachings that then have a spin-off effect that the word you use, persecuted sort of syndrome, where we literally felt, I live in Cooranbong, and we'd look up at the Wadigan Mountains and Sabbath afternoon walks. You'd literally be looking for caves and things. Mental note: one day we will be up here. And yes, I have found that there's, at the core of Adventism teaching, doctrine, and theology, there's a legalistic thrust, and as you say, where you're going to have to defend your faith, and if you don't defend it properly, you won't go to heaven, and if you do defend it, you'll be persecuted on earth. So, yeah, it kind of creates, I think personally, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, a kind of a spiritual abuse for kids that are between 7 and 12. I know that I had nightmares when I was 7 and 8 years old, just thinking about running to the hills and things.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm thinking about raising my son now with the environmental collapse in the news and everywhere, being predicted in the next 20 years, and so much information and about that. And what's is abusive to our children. I mean,
Yeah. Well, I
that's based in
certainly.
sort of more science than the Bible, but I guess it's the same kind of thing where it's in the environment where we are predicting,
apocalyptic events.
Yeah.
I wonder though that we would be taught these things in Sabbath school by a cheery Sabbath school leader, and I try and keep my girls away from that kind of news, whereas within Adventism, unlike other denominations that I've explored, it seems to be so a part of the culture that it's just spoken of every Sabbath to some degree. And people will say, oh, no, it's not. I don't hear that at my church. But there's a general sense of you've got to be ready. Jesus is coming soon. And yes, you're right. It is that apocalyptic kind of end of the world. My mother came across a letter from, I think, my great-great-grandma to her son, and I think it was 1895-ish. And she was talking about the Lord coming soon, and there's this big flu virus going around, and there's wars, and I thought, well, that's today, and that's over 100 years ago. So I'm not trying to criticize Adventists in a specific sense, but I'm just aware there seems to be maybe more opportunity to fall in certain psychological pit holes or potholes. But you're right. Like in the last 2 weeks, I've been watching world events, and I'm really concerned about the world we're bringing our kids into. It seems like Ellen White was right. We are coming into this apocalyptic time.
But I think when you look into history, every generation thought they were
Yeah.
coming to the end. I often think of the generations that saw both World War One and World War Two. What must they have felt?
Yeah.
You know, was there really a future for a peaceful world in their vision? I doubt it. It must have felt like the end of the world. So I think it's always a crisis. But I mean, you know, you could argue we're in much more of a crisis now, and that because of media and we see everything that's happening around the world at
Mm.
once. So, yeah.
Yeah. I know they play that, I think it's an ABC show for kids called BTN, Behind the News.
Yeah.
And I almost and this is, my daughter's in grade 6, and I almost want to call the teacher and say, "Can you stop playing that show to her?" Because she comes home worried about lots of things, from germs to the virus to the war in Ukraine. And I don't know. I know that kids shouldn't be wrapped in cotton wool, but I think there's a time to kind of expose kids to some of the harsher realities of life, and I don't think it's when they're between 6 and 11.
Yeah.
But so tell me a little bit about Ellen White and how she was portrayed to you when you were little, and how that tied into the imminent return of Jesus. It's happening soon. Was that kind of prevalent in your childhood?
Definitely. I remember reading, what was the book she wrote? The Great Controversy?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
I
big
read
one.
that when I was in
Wow.
grade 5 or 6, and
Whoa.
I was struck by how well
Yeah.
written it was and how it, you know, told the story so well. And I remember my first big writing project at school was, you know, um, sort of, I think, loosely plagiarizing some of what she had written, because it was, yeah, about the crucifixion. Yes, I mean, speaking of horror, having to relive the crucifixion, you
Yeah.
know, being preached from the pulpit regularly, I would say that was pretty horrific and scarring, because, you know, the preachers really go into the horror of the crucifixion. It's really quite
Yeah.
graphic. And yeah, I think that probably did affect me a lot. A feeling of, I just am so sick of looking at this picture in my head, you know? I don't think we need to keep
Yeah. It's
watching
graphic.
the
It's
crucifixion
graphic,
over and
isn't it?
over
Yeah.
again. But I get why it's considered, you know, the crux of the whole matter.
It's the
Yes,
centerpiece of Adventism.
yes.
Yeah. Ted Wilson, the current president, because Ellen, even though she apparently became more righteousness by faith and grace oriented towards the end of her life, she still said this book needs to go out to all the world, and he's going to print 1 billion copies of it and give away around the world.
Mm,
Um, and I find that frightening because it is a graphic book. And Ellen, it's like she's written the prequel, expanded on the biblical story, and she adds a sequel all in that one book. It's like this overarching theme that is
mm,
in many ways not biblical at all. Like the way she talks about the crucifixion, the night beforehand, the Judas story, all of these stories
mm.
are so, she expands on them. Did you, and you mentioned there that you really enjoyed the writing style. That you knew that she copied most of the book from other
No,
authors?
no.
Yeah, so, like, yeah, so probably a huge percentage paraphrased, and she
Mm,
had these 2 amazing editors, Fanny Bolton and Marion Davis, and again, they're authors I think you would love, because she would write all these diaries and ideas and thoughts, and lots of them was just handwritten from other books.
mm,
And she'd have it. She was good at collating. She'd have all these general themes in kind of an order of what she wanted to say, and she'd give them to Marion and to Fanny, and they didn't know initially. They would take this content in its raw
mm,
form, and like all good editors, you've probably got an editor for your books too.
mm, mm.
They polish it, fix the grammar, and they made it beautiful.
Right.
You can look at where she got. In fact, they some of the paraphrased, it's there's whole books of where they've shown Ellen White, who she copied from, the Marion Davis version. And they even made the original authors sound better. Like these two women were absolutely incredible and skilled. And when later in life, when they started to realize what Ellen was doing, they challenged her, and Ellen slapped Fanny Bolton in the face once for challenging her. Fanny ended up going to a mental asylum. Marion kind of died relatively young and very unhappy. And it's a shame because they are brilliant writers. You read The Desire of Ages and you go, whoa, this is amazing.
The Desire of Ages I'm thinking of.
Yes, those two.
Yes.
They're both apocalyptic, but The Desire of Ages really unpacks some beautiful stories and
Yeah.
scenes.
Yeah.
But yeah, it turns out it was copied, and the church even did a big study on it in the late 80s, and they said, well, we've found that Ellen only copied word verbatim 2%, but the reality is when you read the study, she plagiarized and paraphrased 80 to 90% of Desire of Ages.
Yeah.
So those kind of things can be hurtful when people find out.
Yes.
And instead of just being really open and honest about it, the church kind of scurries to defend it, and it's just indefensible in many ways. So yeah, with this sense of imminent return of Christ and the apocalyptic stuff and well written, and you're a young girl coming across this. You would have only been like 9 in grade 5 or something like that, 9 or 10. Maybe.
Yeah.
And but you've got this nice Adventist family stuff going around you as well. It's an interesting kind of situation to be in too. I was the same, I think, where there
Yeah.
was so many great things going on. I loved church and Sabbath school, my friends and school, and this notion of going to be in heaven soon, juxtaposed with all this other kind of drama going on. So I want to start talking about the polyamory in a moment, but tell us just a little bit about this sense of Jesus returning soon. How did and as you look back, you left 30 years ago, and Jesus still isn't back. Did that play a part in why you left, or did it play a part in why you stayed?
Big questions, Peter. And I think sometimes you look back on the decisions you've made in your life and you think, and you wanna have a story that explains it all, but it's usually much more complicated than any simple narrative.
Yeah.
I think there was always that sense, the great disappointment, okay? That happened, that's what the church was born from. And then I heard my parents talking about how when they were young, they thought that Jesus was coming back soon, and they always were like, "Well, yeah, we want him to come back, but also we hope we get to have our lives as well,"
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's that kind of conflict, and I felt that too. I thought, "Well, I wanna do some stuff before the world ends, please." Um, it's a difficult thing to navigate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wanting the world to end, but also wanting to live.
Yes, yeah. And these themes, like you said earlier, they are human themes. We all have to grow up, we all mature, we all deal with stuff that we went through. I think every human, it's not a uniquely Adventist thing. And yeah, that's why I want to make sure that we're not coming across as criticizing people or the church even. We're just exploring our own journey
Mm,
from
mm.
childhood to adulthood, and all the things you traverse on the way there.
Yeah. I mean, that I think that growing up in a really insular, self-contained community where you hardly know well, we didn't anyway. We had a few relatives who were outside the church, but, they weren't friends. There wasn't a lot of interaction with neighbors or anyone outside the church. And so when I did move outside it to go to university,
Mm.
I suddenly saw the diversity of beliefs all held just as passionately and strongly as the Seventh-day Adventist and Christian beliefs, and I started to get a bit of perspective historically, and I started to, um, you know, just see that it was just one way. And
Mm.
I think I'd never before met people who were able to be not only atheist or agnostic, but also good, moral, kind, people doing, acts of service in the world. And I'm like, it's not the only way of being a good person. Whereas I think when I was growing up, I thought it was the only way that any good person could really live once they'd heard the word, the message.
Yeah, the truth.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We were raised to think we had the truth. Isn't that interesting? It's like a university or a maturity or growing into your culture or community at large. It's like the many different rivers. You think you're in your river only, but the rivers all hit the ocean. And when you
Mm,
hit the ocean, you suddenly see, wow, there's all these other rivers come. But there's a moment when the river hits the ocean where there's a lot of turbulence and a collision of the ocean of maturity and adulthood with this river that you've been kind of flowing down. So you probably find that even the people that you met in uni, the agnostics, even those doing good things, maybe they too, we all have to grow up and face our demons and
mm,
and so in your book Fallen, did you what were the kind of the main themes? And I will be reading it this week, but what were the main themes that you kind of covered there? You said it was a 3-week look or 3 days. What was the
3 weeks. So it was, I guess it was, there were some flashbacks to my childhood growing up as an Adventist, and then why I got married so young, and then making those promises that you make when you marry someone and you fully believe till death do us part, forsaking all others, and how that is a crisis when you realize you can't honor that and yet be true to yourself. And so that sort of mirrored my own, collapse of faith, I suppose. It was, I mean, yeah. So sex was probably one of the gateways for me to be realizing I don't really fit in with this paradigm, this moral kind of universe where you really, it's just very, very black and white. And yeah, so it's a book about sex and religion and marrying too young, and how it can be very transformative when you suddenly realize you made a promise and you committed yourself to something, and you're not gonna be able to deliver.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. And then it's interesting that you make these decisions, and if you culturally or the church or other people push you into making these decisions, you then feel this huge sense of responsibility to staying with it. But what if it's not what you would have chosen as an adult,
Mm.
I think it's often better for people to be allowed to kind of grow up and hit 25 before they are maybe it should be illegal to marry before you're 25 or something like that.
Well, you really are very young when you're
Yeah.
20.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, my parents got married at 19 and 20,
Yeah.
and that's kind of, I don't know if kids are still doing that inside the church. I'm not sure if beliefs and the culture of around sexuality has changed much, but
I don't
yeah.
think it's changed much at all, really. I think there's even a turn back to get married earlier and this kind of thing. I want my girls to get married early, so because I'm such an old dad, I want to have grandkids. So,
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah.
now, David, sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, look, it can work for a lot of people, and maybe that's one way to have a very happy and stable life if you find the right person young enough and you stick with them. I'm not at all against marriage, monogamy, finding your right person and staying with them.
Mm.
It's just not many people manage that, I don't think.
Yeah, statistically, no.
Mm.
Yeah. I'll just bring a couple of comments and questions in as we just transition to talking about this next phase and the next book that's coming out. Faye Simpson writes over there on Facebook, and she's just referring to this Ellen G. White little side convo we had there. I've been a Seventh-day Adventist for 89 years, and I haven't read any of Ellen White's books. How bad of me. I don't fit the SDA model anymore. Logan Smith writes, and I had a really interesting interview with Logan and Andrew Skeggs last week. Logan's from Western Australia, and I think you went to Carmel, I think, is that
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
college.
And he writes, being good without God is actually a thing.
Yes, who knew?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so David 1221, I'm not sure if that's David that we know that we spoke of earlier, but he says he is 61. In my wildest dreams, I never imagined 30 to 40 years ago that this would even be a public discussion. And I think that's great. That's progress in my mind. Thanks for that comment, David. And I'm super pleased that we're getting to have this kind of conversation in a public platform where it can't be suppressed or cancelled unless I reach the bell curve and say things that social media picks up on. So I'm keen to talk now a little bit. I'll bring it back up onto the screen here about double happiness. And just for those who may have joined a little bit late, just share again about this book. We've shared about your life, just briefly touched on things and how, great, overall happy. I agree with you. You go anywhere in the world, walk into Adventist church, you feel like you know everybody already. There's some beautiful things to Adventism that unite, and particularly if it has a 60s, 70s Jesus kind of focus, it can be very positive.
Mhm.
We've talked about you leaving the church, and we've got this next era, this double happiness book, and it talks about a whole new thing, and in some ways a controversial topic. So tell us a little bit about the book again, and then someone else has asked, where is it? I can't find it now. They're wanting you to define for us. Oh, here we go. Yeah, what exactly is polyamorous? So maybe in telling us again a little bit about the book, how you wrote it, all around it, and what polyamorous actually means.
So polyamory is the practice and philosophy of being able to have a loving and committed relationship with more than one person. It's a form of consensual non-monogamy. So there are lots of different ways to be non-monogamous, but polyamory is about honesty. It's about every part of the equation being fully informed about what's going on, and being able to choose what form the relationship should take. So this is a story about how a woman comes to terms with the fact that she's in love with more than one person, and where a lot of people just have affairs or are serially monogamous, break up with one person, burn the whole show down, split the children up, whatever. This is about a choice that to try and incorporate the new person into the family and form a different sort of community, I suppose. So yes, it's definitely not mainstream, but I think outside of the church, people would find that non-monogamy is definitely on the rise, and a lot of people are experimenting because just being just lying and cheating and having affairs isn't an ethical way to live. So, yeah. It's a love story, but it's a different kind of love
Kind of love story, yeah.
story.
And it's going to be released in October.
Yeah.
And have you? 'Cause you've done a fair. I've in researching you, I came across lots of TV interviews with you talking to on different TV shows. Um, how have your books been received, and have you had any kind of early feedback and commentary on this soon to be released book from
Um,
media types and people in the industry and people who've pre-read it and your friends, family, that kind of thing? What kind of what kind of feedback have you had?
yeah, okay. So, I have had, people in the literary community read it, and, I've had, reviewers talk about how it's very philosophical, and it's an interrogation of the nature of love and the way it changes can change over time, and what it means to try and live in truth, when it comes to your, sexuality and the way people change over time. It's, I'm being interviewed by Compass, the ABC,
Mm,
um, show about religion, because they're doing an episode on,
right.
the future of love and non-monogamy and how that fits into, um, changing ways of thinking. So,
When
yeah.
will that be?
Well, they're coming to film at my house, which is a little bit, terrifying on the weekend, but I think it'll be later on this year. I'll let
Yeah,
you know when it's
that
been.
would be great. Let us know. We'll I'll advertise it in here. That'd be something we'd all love to follow up on.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, people within the, polyamorous and, non-monogamous communities are interested in reading about it because their experience hasn't been reflected, very widely. I mean, there are a few TV series and shows about it, but yeah. Excuse me.
That's all right. I think we mentioned off air that Danny Klopovich is a mutual friend,
Yeah.
and he's asked a couple of very interesting questions.
Hi,
I'll
Danny.
I'll bring them onto the screen. There's three, and because the screen doesn't fit the full thing, I'll just bring each one individually. Danny has written, "We can never know what might have been, but do you think or wonder if you had not been raised in the Seventh-day Adventist subculture growing up, instead in an open secular environment, that you would have gravitated to polyamory from the outset? In other words, is polyamory something that you would have always wanted as a way of life?"
Interesting question,
Mm,
Danny. Of course, thank you. A great thinker and philosopher in his own right.
mm,
Um, that's I don't know. I don't know. I do wonder sometimes if, um, I've sort of gravitated towards this way of life as a way of honoring my own form of loyalty and, honesty. Um, but if I'd been allowed to explore more when I was young and have more experiences, I probably would have come to something different. And like, who knows who we'd be without this subculture and the way we were raised. I've had people say to me, "Aren't you angry that you were raised in such a repressive environment, and that this was a form of child abuse, blah, blah, blah." And I'm like, "I don't even know who I'd be without this. I like the way I've turned out, so I'm not gonna wish that away. Everything that's happened has made me who I am now, and there's good and bad in whatever way you're brought up." So,
mm,
yeah.
mm. Yeah, that's true. It's a good question, and it's a hard one to answer for the reasons you just said. Moto Sapien has written, "Rochelle, do you mean you knew you wouldn't be able to be monogamous?" Was that a thread, perhaps he's saying, that ran through your thoughts growing up?
Um,
Because some people have a higher um, opportunity rate and a higher desire rate. Some people might desire to be, you know, uh, out there and or non-monogamous to whatever degree, and some people have the opportunities and some people just don't. For you personally, I guess Motor Sapien is do you think that monogamous part wasn't going to be for you? It's similar to what Danny was asking.
Well, when I grew up as a little girl, imagining my future, I always wanted the one. And when I got married, I really wanted the one. But I was a very sexual creature. I think I have probably always been quite liberated in that respect and been, had a drive, had a biological drive that maybe is higher than some people's. I don't know. I'm, a menopausal woman now, so obviously things do change over the life cycle. But I think I really wanted to find the one. And so what happened with my first marriage is that I got married, and then he didn't wanna have that kind of relationship with me. He was interested in other things. So I made this commitment, I'm gonna be with this person. Do I just decide I'm gonna be sort of semi-celibate for the rest of my life, or do I, what do I do with this drive? And I think a lot of people, whether they be, homosexual or whatever, are going to have that feeling of, I have desires, and is there an ethical way for me to pursue my desires and be a whole person with all the parts of me integrated, or do I need to shut down a part of myself in order to work with my values? And I mean, I think if you were a Seventh-day Adventist, you probably would say you just need to deny yourself.
Yeah, it's a very personal journey, I think, isn't it? Like, you're not saying everyone should do what you did, but some people tend
God
to
knows.
lean to say that you or others should do it their way. That's an interesting
Mm.
sociological thing that I often ponder. Faye Simpson, the 89-year-old, writes, and hi, Faye, nice to have you commenting. Um, she says the problem with this culture is perhaps jealousy comes into it. Have you found that in the polyamorous community that jealousy plays a role? Did that play a role in your situation? Um,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. Jealousy is definitely part of the equation, but the thing I notice in, polyamorous and non-monogamous communities is that you deal with that jealousy in an open way, or you try to, and you meet it head on, and you acknowledge it, and you find ways of not letting it define you. Um and I think in our culture, we have a real issue with jealousy and possessiveness. And I think this is expressed in a lot of the domestic violence and, statistics around women being killed by their intimate partners, because I think a lot of it's not about not being able to deal with having the difficult emotions of jealousy. Um, so I suppose, my answer is yes, jealousy is a thing, but it's something that we can it's a grappling with yourself and your, um, your beliefs and your ability to transcend that, your ability to evolve and be generous towards your partner. And, yeah,
Yeah,
it's a journey.
yeah. Do you think, jealousy is a social construct, or is there some kind of primal, um, biological reason that it has, found its way into our being?
Well, I think it's both, of course, nature and nurture. And I think our culture teaches us that it's okay to have a crime of passion. You might get off, the judge might let you off a bit more easily if you kill your wife because she was cheating on you than if you just kill your wife because, she did some other crime. Um, Not crime, if she did
Yeah.
something else you don't like. So I think we have jealousy towards our siblings. I think we have jealousy towards our colleagues or people who might get more fame or acclaim or money or whatever. But I think, I think we're all going to have to deal with envy and jealousy in some way. But I think we have a culture that probably doesn't foster sharing and making sure everyone has enough. I mean, capitalism is very individualistic, and I don't think it really promotes, you know, a more socially minded
Mm.
sharing of resources.
It's interesting. Capitalism may not work, but it seems to be the only modality that has brought Western civilization to some point of looking at itself and being able to say we don't like capitalism, or we don't like slavery, or we want equality for men and women. Um, Prior to capitalism, most modalities were suppressive. So it's an interesting thing you raised there. Like we want to do away with capitalistic greed and selfishness, and creating um, a lack for some people, and in some ways poverty.
Mm.
But how do we come to another kind of paradigm or modality when in some ways capitalism was looking at itself in a healthy way and was trying to bring it, like it is the capitalist regime that has ended slavery, has fought for women's vote, has brought about, but it seems to be turning in on itself now. So I'm wondering if it destroys itself, are we going to open ourselves to some other kind of regime or modality, or kind of manifestation of leadership that takes us back? I can't think of any other option that
Yeah.
like a self-reflecting capitalism, which seemed to be what was working in the 90s, and now is just turning on itself, where you but I don't see any alternatives. Like, I see a lot of people criticizing what we have as a Western civilization, but I can't point to any other kind of way of living and governing humanity that's better.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a very modified form of capitalism in Australia. We have, taxation and public health and public education to a certain extent, but it's that balancing, isn't it, of freedom and responsibility. So on the
Yeah.
one hand, you have individual freedom, and on the other hand, you have responsibility to your fellow human beings. And
Mm.
I mean, that's something that you have to balance in um, any form of relationship
Yeah.
that you have,
Yeah.
romantically as well. So I think there's always this trading off
Yeah.
between, personal freedom and the greater good, I suppose.
And I think the theme that's running through our conversation is that, yes, there will be challenges, but these are things you have to face honestly. And I think that's an important thing for people to do. Faye Simpson writes again, your drive never goes with the right person. I understand exactly what you're saying. That's another thing, isn't it? To find that, and it's not just about the sexual passion, but all sorts of energy and ideas and ideologies, and you can't just dominate and squash your way through. It's a constant conversation, a to and fro, um, to work on these things. Someone else has written, and they don't want to. They've written privately. Did the polyamorous relationship spoken of in the book work? Is it still going? Someone has just asked that question.
Are they talking about the novel?
Yes, the novel, the
The
double.
novel, yeah, it's a happy ending, yes. And I mean, in my life, I have a partner that I've been with for 26 years, and I have another partner that I've been with for 10 years. So that seems to have some longevity. But yeah, I mean, people say about these sort of things, do they ever work? Do these arrangements ever work? Didn't we try that in the 70s? And, it's like, well, monogamy, does that ever work? Sometimes it does, sometimes it
Mm,
doesn't.
yeah, I think it's higher. Is it close to being over 50% monogamous relationships and marriages don't work anyway?
I Yeah, I think so.
Something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Adam Gillard writes, "What's needed is repentance, conformity to God's law, and relying on Christ's merits." To me, and thanks for your comment, Adam. I don't mind hearing from all sides, but it sounds a little bit like you're coming from a higher moral ground. How do you feel when people, and you did address this a little bit, but how do you feel when you hear that kind of pushback?
Well, I mean, that's to be expected, isn't it? Because if you are operating within the sort of guidelines of the Bible and fairly conservative Christianity, and particularly what I would call fringe, I think SDA, the Seventh Adventist Church is one of the more sort of. I always used to object when people called it a cult. I do not like it being called a cult, but it's definitely one of the more, like you say, there are groups of people who are former Mormons and former, was it Jehovah's Witnesses?
Yes,
Yes,
yeah,
former Seventh Adventists, and I think it's because it's such a cultural, and social construct that's not just about being a Christian and believing in the general, Jesus was a great,
yeah,
whatever. It's about more than that. And I think if you're within that, you could not have an open-minded acceptance and
yeah.
tolerance of
Mm.
this, of non-monogamy. So yeah, I anticipate that sort of judgment, and of course, I was brought up with it. So in one sense, I feel it deeply, and there is always going to be a battling with some shame inside of me, and I accept that that's just a
Mm.
um, part of the equation, really. Although it does feel like a very small part of the equation now, the further I get away from it, and yeah.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah, some good insights there. Now, I know we've only got you for about 10 more minutes. Can I just quickly give a plug for what's coming up tomorrow while we've got a big audience watching? I'm starting a series within our series. I was going to call it the lecture series, but it might be better to call it the scholars or the scholar series, something like that. A lot of Adventist scholars have been on the program in the past, Rochelle. The whole of season 2 is pretty much 86 interviews with scholars talking about the Des Ford era and what went on at Glacier View. And to me, I was a pig in mud. Just this is amazing. Recently, a lot of the more scholarly, academic, smarter than me kind of people, they want to just share their story, their work in a format that's more me just listen. You've noticed this is more of a conversation than an interview. um, and so I've put the feelers out, and it seems to people are responding. Where we're going to have invite scholars onto the program, people like Matthew Cortman, Milton Hook, etc., Gil Valentine, Gillian Ford, and I'm just going to sit back and say, away you go. Tell us, give us your talk today, and this will free them up to just share their little thoughts. And so tomorrow we're starting that series. And Rochelle, you're a wordsmith. You might be able to come up with the scholars series, the lecture series. I don't want people to think they're being lectured at, but tomorrow we're starting in the morning, 11:30 Australian time, Thursday, which is Wednesday, 6:30 p.m. Pacific time, with Milton Hook, and it'll be me saying, "Hi, Milton, go for it," and then in the afternoon, 4 o'clock our time, we will be talking to John Rosier, and I'm really looking forward to that. Milton's topic is called Ellen G. White. Did she speak according to God's word? So that's tomorrow, 11:30 Thursday, or 6:30 in California on the Wednesday. So thanks for letting me put that little plug in there, Rochelle. It's a whole new series. Have you got any thoughts? Should I lecture? The more I say it, doesn't seem to work. Scholar.
Oh,
Some people are like, oh, don't call me a scholar.
I
But
think scholars is good.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I have noticed in myself a real resistance to being lectured or sermonized at. And I
Yes.
think this comes from my, I think it's some form of trauma of sitting through too many meetings,
Yeah.
like meetings and meetings and meetings. Like,
Yeah.
and, some people outside the church said to me, "What are all the meetings for? What are they about?" And
Yeah,
I'm
there's Vespers, there's Sabbath school, there's church, there's MVs, there's AYs,
yeah,
closing Sabbath, opening Sabbath, Wednesday night prayer meeting,
it's too
Busy
much.
Bee Sunday, yeah.
But obviously there's an appetite for it. And, something I really did get that was a positive thing from my Seventh-day Adventist upbringing was, I think, a respect for knowledge and learning and um, education, and investigating the text, And I think that only went so far, and it could only go so far because you'd come up against the limits of the Bible. And if the Bible said no, that's the final word. And I mean, if you started to question whether the Bible was actually, a reliable text, well, then you just had to leave. But I think that genuine sort of hermeneutic scholarship,
Yeah.
I really like that in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I hope that they can, um, yeah, develop that and maybe provide some spaces for some diverse kind of opinions and interpretations, and allow that people can have different ways of
Mm,
seeing it.
mm.
Mm.
Yeah, well said. And I think essentially that, and like you say, some of these Adventist scholars are incredible. That what they've
Mm.
written is just, and I've been in awe of the fascinating way they present their ideas and thoughts, and they're often pushing back on church theology and church structure and politics. And I think essentially it's just they don't like me interrupting their flow. So. So it could be called the Pete Listens series. So anyway, that's coming up, guys, and that we'll have our first two kicking off tomorrow. So we'll just read a couple of comments, and if there's any you've seen there that you would like to talk to, and then we'll say a big thank you for coming on the program today, and let you wrap up with any closing remarks. Motor Sapien put, it's not for everyone by any means, but my wife and I were married at 20 and 22 respectively. We're each other's only partners, 16 years on, and we wouldn't have it any other way. And I think that's great, Motor Sapien. And I've gotten to know you, Motor Sapien, through the show. Full respect, and I think that's really awesome. Nat Almy has written, "Get married early and have lots of babies. I wish I would have done that." Yeah, I didn't get married till I was 48. I'd been traveling.
Really?
Yeah, I was traveling around playing music. I had my first baby when I was 50. Well, my wife had our baby. Um, and yeah,
There's
that's
no one way.
how it
Yeah,
worked out.
yeah.
And my kids are only just starting to notice that I'm older than their friends' daddies. It's going to be interesting in the next few years how that unfolds. I'm trying to stay fit, keep exercising. I want to be around. So yeah, Nat, I agree. Not for me, but I hope my girls get married early and start having babies. I'm joking. I'm joking. Anything else that you saw coming out? There's been so many comments.
I can't see
Um,
any comments, so if
oh,
you
maybe you're only seeing the main screen here.
yeah.
That's kind of good in a way because lots of comments can throw people. I'll just have a quick look. Um, down the side here, yeah, lots of fascinating conversations going on, which is really great. I encourage that. It's interesting. Ellen White early on, they had a thing called was it the Holy Kiss or something like that? They had some pretty interesting, quirky um, practices going on in early Adventism,
I
where
mean, what's
they'd throw themselves on the floor and they'd get all ecstatic and yeah.
yeah. What's the, probably not a oh, yes, King Solomon, I can see that. Yeah, King Solomon.
King Solomon. Thanks,
Sexy
Nilo.
Solomon.
And sorry, what were you going to say? I
Oh,
interrupted
I was
you.
just gonna say, what's the status of Ellen White in the church now? I don't know.
Oh,
Is
it's
it
identical to what back
yeah,
then. Yeah, there's a
yeah.
huge push. There is constantly the more progressive liberal pushing back against the more conservative, the conservatives being defined and know who they are, and they're monetized and organized as always, and they want the progressives out, but the progressives say, hey, this is our church as well, let's be inclusive of everybody. The Adventist apologists are identical to back then as they are to this day. It's such a similar world to when you would have left it. Like, like 1979 to 1985 is identical to 2019 to to next year. Is gonna, yeah. The leadership's conservative. Ellen White is being held up on a pedestal by a majority of Adventists. Even the progressive Adventists love Ellen White, but they want her further in the back of the bus, see her in more perspective. She's more of an inspiration than a prophet. Last generation theology is on the rise again, which is, if you keep the three angels message and follow Ellen White's teachings, the Lord will return again. And progressives are like, where do you get that from? And Ellen White taught that. So it's all pretty much the same.
It's funny that you can have so many different you can hold many different ideas at the same time. So on the one hand, I believed Ellen White was a prophetess, the true prophet of the church. And on the other hand, my friends and I in high school would be like, she was hit in the head by a rock, guys. Mental illness. This is just not okay. That we take her word as gospel. I mean, almost above the Bible. So I think it's interesting that you can have so many different interpretations of what Seventh-day Adventism can be. And if there's anything I've learned from being polyamorous and navigating non-monogamy, it's about conflict resolution and about there being able to be many voices and a way, conflict resolution is a set of skills where you can allow difference to exist. And I think that's something that's just applicable wherever you move.
Yeah. I think sadly within Adventism, and the reason I left in a nutshell is I realized this loop is never going to change. This loop that we're in now, that was the same when you were young, that was the same when your parents were young, that's been going on since 1851. After the first 7 years of Adventism post 1844, it's an endless loop that won't end, and it won't end. People will not reach this idea that you speak of, which I love, which I think is important, to, hey, let's listen to the different ideas. Let's find a place where we can hold these different ideas in tension or agree to disagree or whatever. But the core teaching of Adventism is Jesus didn't come back that night in 1844. He's coming back soon. Be ready. To be ready, we have to vindicate God, prove Satan's claim wrong that you can't keep the commandments. To do that, at the end of time, in the time of trouble, Jesus will call a certain group to not sin without him being there as an intercessor, to prove to the angels and the other planets that God is vindicated, you can keep the commandments. And then that when the people do that, then he returns. So that's the kernel of Adventism in writing, taught by Ellen, held up on high by all the key leaders and the key sources of Adventism. And because that's such a unique doctrine, it's the only unique doctrine, the investigative judgment, the sanctuary doctrine, it can never be removed. So it can never fully be challenged. So you can push against it, discuss it, look at different issues, but at its very core, it cannot be subtracted, or it's no longer Adventism. So when I realized that, I thought, people would say, "Oh, stay and bring about the change," but what they were meaning is bring about standard change and a little bit more open with love and music and loving each other. But Adventism at a theological, doctrinal level won't change, and we're all downstream of that doctrine. So if you're in the Adventist swimming river, you're downstream of that doctrine. You just can't get out of the water. Well, you've got to get out of the water to not believe it. Anyway, that's a little bit of a quick theological summary for you there.
Wow, you're taking me back there, Peter.
Matthew Tuller's, we'll quickly wrap it up now. Matthew Tuller's there's a little conversation going on with a guy called Rodney who keeps watching the show and is predicting I will rejoin the church. and he's a bit shocked that I'm having these conversations. And Matthew is pointing out Peter's just having conversations with different people. You aren't required to agree with everyone, to respect their view and conversation, which is what you just said. And Nat writes, King Solomon's demise was women. Andy Mac, good to see you watching, Andy, also from Western Australia. I don't have a boyfriend, let alone two of them. Now, Andy, I've been a bit of a matchmaker in my time with, so let me work on it for you. PM me a list of traits and qualities you'd like in a man, and I'll find someone here for you. Rose Power has written, has the human race really evolved? We're just repeating it over and over again. And to some degree, this loop within Adventism is repeating in the world and culture. And there's always these conversations where people want to think outside the box, like you have, Rochelle, and you've explored honest dialogue with your feelings. You've brought them onto the table. You've shared them with the people in your life. I think that's got to be commended. And yeah, look, so many interesting comments. I could spend all day just going through these and chatting and referring to these. I've really enjoyed our conversation today, Rochelle. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. Let us know when you are on Compass. We'll watch it. Come back on the program maybe when your book is out, and we can talk a little bit more about it and how it's being received. And I'm just going to quickly bring them up onto the screen again while you think about some closing thoughts. But yeah, my guest today has been Rochelle. Let me make sure I pronounce it. Siemienowicz, and I think I'm getting that pretty accurately there. There's Double Happiness.
Yeah.
And Rochelle has written more than 2 books, or are these your 2 that kind
Just
of...
2 books. I've written a lot of journalism, mainly about film and television, which is more my specialty. But thank you so much for having me. Peter, it's been a really interesting conversation and really nice to revisit that part of my life. And I just want to commend you for opening up this space to have discussions that, allow some different points of view. And it's been really, really interesting. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Rochelle. I've enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone that's watched today. Don't forget tomorrow's Scholar series. Pete steps back, lets people speak. And we'll look forward to catching you again down the track. See you later.
See you. Bye.